Okay, so in this video we're going to talk about the color workflow a little bit, creating textures inside of Gaea. In this particular video we're going to focus on the issues that you're going to encounter in this overall workflow. You have to first be aware of the limitations before you can really take advantage of any of the tools that you're going to be encountering here. So one of the first issues that you're going to have to look at is that this is a height map software. It builds things in 2 dimensions. It may display a 3-dimensional model of sorts in here, but the information is all based on 2-dimensional results, black and white height information. So this has a certain side effect to it. Right now I've got just a simple height map going in here. I just took a mountain and blurred it so that it's really soft and you can see that. And I took a Perlin noise and then I just plug it into a clutter here. And the clutter is of course going to convert that black and white information into this gradient that's here. And we can see this map across the surface and it looks okay. It's kind of weird, but it looks okay. And that's because it's a nice smooth transition from, well, not necessarily smooth, it doesn't have to be smooth, but it's a nice even transition. If I did something a little bit more extreme, say like a cliff face or a really tall mountain, then I have more extreme angles applied to it. And that's when this breaks. So if I go in here and apply this, what you can see here is that steeper face leads to a visual error where I've got lots of detail, and then it just becomes a straight line and it becomes detail again. And that's because this is essentially just a handful of faces which have been stretched out. Sort of like this sheet itself was a big sheet of rubber. And we painted this texture onto the rubber beforehand, and then we just grabbed it and we pushed on it from the other side to create this shape. And of course, certain sections are then stretching. And that's the result that you're going to have to deal with. So with this kind of thing, there isn't a lot that you can do to combat it here, but you can combat it in other software after the fact. Now, because it has to happen in other software, you don't really have this possibility of dealing with that area here in the texturing process. So if you want to texture things inside of Gaea, you're going to run into this issue. This is going to be something that's going to fight against you. Now, if you need to take it somewhere else in order to deal with it, if you've been using Gaea for a while, you may remember there was some textured shaders that were applied, and they were a bit of a misleading kind of effect because they had what was called triplanar mapping on them. So triplanar mapping is basically taking any kind of surface and creating a series of projections at different angles. So faces facing in that direction are not really showing the texture that this is. They're showing like screen projectors, where they're projecting onto only flat surfaces based on the angle that they're projecting through. And they project in 3D, so what you see on this side would appear on that side, what's on this side would appear on the opposite side as well, and the top and then the bottom. And so it projects straight through. And this can give you the illusion that it is a better overall mapping result. Now, these can all be the same kind of texture. This image just helps you illustrate the difference between the different projections, but if they were all the same sort of tile, they have this sort of blending between them that you can adjust how much kind of crossfade happens between these 2 different variations, and it may look like one solid overall texture. So you can get away with triplanar mapping in order to get this to work. The other area in which you can approach things is in the UV mapping. Now, UV mapping is basically just the way that we unwrap, just kind of like package design. If you have ever dealt with creating your own cards, maybe like birthday cards would be an example of this to a certain degree, where you create it on one sheet of paper and then you fold it into 4 to create the card from it. Or if you've printed out any of those paper models that you glue the different pieces together and you get a paper construction. That's essentially what UVs are. We have this possibility of breaking off sections, kind of cutting them open and doing it. Another example of this would be in real world, if you've used a mandarin orange and you've tried to peel it out into one piece and then lay that all flat. And you notice that you have to make various cuts in order to get it nice and flat. So with this kind of surface, we probably cut off the top and the base, and this area in here we'd deal with it kind of like a bottle label, where we just slice it down one edge and lay that out nice and flat. And in that UV area we would go ahead and apply our paint and texturing to that surface. This means taking it to another piece of software, unwrapping it differently, and then taking it for texturing elsewhere. Now in some tools like Maya, you have the possibility of building your mesh and having its map kind of translated from one version to another version. So another issue that is in here is not just the fact that the texture stretches, but there's actually not much in the way of polygons here as well. So there's no actual physical detail. So you could go ahead and take this into something like Maya or ZBrush, and you could rebuild the topology in here so that it would actually have more potential for detail, which you could then sculpt in, say, Mudbox, ZBrush, Blender, any one of those tools directly in Maya as well. Once you'd sculpted that detail in there, of course, UVs, as I mentioned, and then any texturing that you had done initially inside of Gaea that you want to transfer over to make use of, you can bake that information. And the process of baking, we're not talking about cookies or cakes or anything like that. The process of baking is taking one type of information and converting it to another. So you have these UVs here where everything is all based on this flat piece of rubber kind of concept, and taking it to the other where it's a paper sculpture kind of concept where you cut it into different pieces and you put the texture on and the different islands of information there. And so you can transfer it from one version to the other via something called transfer maps, which is on the rendering lighting category. Transfer maps will allow you to send from a source object to a target object. So those are some ways in which you can deal with this situation. Now, moving along, go down here. We have, of course, all the height map versions that we can bring in, so any of the inputs, which we can process through a variety of different tools as well. And we can take the height map information and convert it based off these color settings. We also have things like sat maps, which are basically the same color gradient concept, but it's been applied with a few additional controls like noise. You can invert, add some jittering and stuff like that. And they're pre-built gradients, and there's a lot of them. There's, you know, a whole lot of them, all the way up to 1,699 right now, and I heard tell of there being more perhaps in the future. So these ones which are more subtle in their gradation to some of these mid-range ones where they're far more complex. There's a lot of variable detail in there, and, you know, in between areas where, you know, they're kind of an interesting mix. So these are kind of pre-made gradients, and then you have a few other tools that we'll discuss at a later point, but that's the essentials for creating the colors, and then the texture comes from whatever input that you put into it, which is black and white information. So if you're not using something like a Perlin or Mountain or Voronoi or any one of these initial generators, right, these ones in here, then you're taking these ones to start from and you're running them through different processes. You can do adjustments, you can run filters on them to change the data into a different kind of format. Let's say something like what it would look like if we did cells to this. And cells would then end up looking like that. And so you have this Voronoi pattern that goes across the surface. So we're altering this data in one way or another. Of course, we have the ability of basing it on the simulation tools. So we have erosion, and if we take something like erosion and apply that to let's say the mountain, but we're going to do something to it first. Let's go up, we'll do an auto levels to the mountain, and then we'll plug that into the erosion. And what that will do is it will give me more data. Just take a look at that. More data for wear and deposit and flow. Right, all the flow information can go through that. So I'm just going to run that pipe up here. And so instead of using this stuff here to run my texture information, I can use things like the wear information to apply the variation, or let's go back with that. So we still get that stretching, but we're going to get, you know, other information coming through here. We went back to this here. So getting little details in there, or the deposits, or the flow. Of course, your choice of colors impacts this significantly. So taking the sat maps, plug that into there, take something like flow for example, and we can flip through these things and get some interesting effects based off of that. So we're limited by the information that we have in here. It's all down to selectors, modifications, and filters, these simulations, and then there's other simulations. You see these are also yellow, so they're also sort of simulation-based data maps. And then selection-based maps where it's based on just the angle of a surface, or slope. Slope is great for doing, you know, areas of snow, for example. So if we were to take that information into slope, and we get, you know, an idea of sort of snowfall on the surface. But this is again essentially a solid color, so there's only so far that we can go with the texturing directly in here. Now if the detail of the height map is really good, chances are you probably don't need a whole lot more to make it work. It also depends on what kind of information you're trying to create. Like a snowy mountain in a certain level of exposure is essentially going to be like this. It's going to be basically a whitish color with a darker stone, because the stone will appear dark because of the exposure level. So you may be able to get away with just basic solid colors, but if you want to add more detail, you may need to start thinking about using the tools in here to create masks for producing other textures. So you would take photographic information or hand-painted information as a resource, which you will combine with the maps that you produce in here in order to get this end result that you're looking to get. So those are some of the main pitfalls that you're dealing with in here. There's some advantages and disadvantages, but we'll go through some very more specific examples in a later video. So hopefully you found some information here and have an idea of what you're dealing with, and we'll move on to the next video.